Next is Mr. Saltelli about some critical questions concerning evidence-based policy. I would like to ask everyone to follow the good example and to keep this 10 minutes time frame. Thank you.
My talk will be on, next slide please, will be on some doubts we can put forward in relation to evidence-based policy. So I would like to say that the Science for Policy is now at the center of a storm which concern issues of trust and science governance. But these also affect the economic thought as such. The crisis of science concerns reproducibility, quality control, existence of skills, while the economic thought is plagued by other diseases like loss of diversity, physics, envy, mathematization, and others. But though there are differences between the two crises, I see myself into two crisis elements which are in common. So they could be called twin crises. Can you go back a second? Okay, no, you're right. Okay, one more. Okay. And I will also advocate, as was discussed yesterday, and you saw yesterday in practice, because you saw it happening, that the demarcation model, doesn't work, is not acceptable. You rejected it vigorously when it was proposed to you yesterday. Quantification in the context of evidence-based policy is extremely problematic, is often problematic. And you can find everything about what I say in a paper which is online, which is indicated there on my website. So the crisis, I mentioned the issue of trust. We used to say many years ago that there were, so-called weak issues where we were difficult to agree, and these were typically GMO and climate. But today, everything is weak. The culling of badges, boys, children born to gay couples, bees and pesticide, and so on and so forth. I won't mention the list, but this slide is just to say that whenever science is used to settle a political controversy, trust is nowhere. There is a lot really of discussion. And surprisingly, the media are taking note that the science used in this controversy is not always of the highest quality. And 2 years ago, The Economist dedicated the cover to say that something horribly wrong was going on in science. If you read the quote over there, it talks of false trail laid down by shoddy research. Shoddy means, research of very poor quality, and that science should be very careful because if they continue this way, they could lose the respect they deserve. One more, in fact, the editorial of Economist was motivated by other, academic paper where they discovered that there is a dramatic crisis in reproducibility, for instance, in organic chemistry, in preclinical cancer trials. This is really worrying because this means that you could be given a treatment because it passed the preclinical cancer trial, but those trials were no good. So in fact, you are dead already when you receive the treatment. One more. Here you have two more quotes for you, just, in the cases of those preclinical cancer trials, I mentioned Begley and Ellis could reproduce only 11% of the original funding. The second statement is very recent, a few days ago, is the so-called NOSEC report on psychological studies. They have rerun 100 studies, and they could confirm only half of the cases. What is not written on the slide is that the effect was much smaller in the second analysis than it was found in the first one. And there are a lot of initiatives out there in the web to fight these. There is Retraction Watch is a very interesting website to watch because they keep the journal accountable for how they go about retracting. The Reproducibility Initiative involving Ioannidis. But fixing the mess is not easy because, as it was discussed today, it's not easy to get the data from past treatment. So you have this other article. This is another recent scandal. This was about how easy it was to convince conservative people that gay marriage was a good idea. It seemed to be the case, but then it was found that the data were a hoax. The New York Times titled "Scientists Who Cheat," we are at that. Nature titled "Misplaced Faith." And Nature made a very interesting observation, and that is that indeed people still trust science. But should people trust science? Next. One aspect of this crisis which is also neglected, at least I find some neglect in the institution, is that there is a terrible waste of money associated with it. There are different numbers given there. Ioannidis says that 85% of all research money is simply wasted. If this were to be true, the implication for policy would be, you can imagine, tremendous. Lancet offer a different number for the USA, 200 billion wasted in 1 year is also a significant number. And yet, what I'm really surprised is that when we discuss science for policy, people neglect the existence of this crisis in science. The report of the OECD, which I'm mentioning, which you have in your literature quoted, because it was quoted also by the brief prepared by the European Parliament, is a report on science advice, and it never talks about crisis of the science. It talks about science being deployed in crisis situation, ignoring that science is in a crisis situation itself. Okay, and I think you cannot really separate science advice from the science crisis, because there are some element of the science which is used for policy, such as mathematical and statistical modeling, which are precisely those which are more at the core of the crisis, which are more contested for their rigorous. Okay, if you like, I could indulge to say that this has been foreseen many, many years ago by scholars in the fields of science and technology study. I don't want to spend more time on this, but the Solar Prize predicted that science would collapse under its own weight, a victim of its exponential growth. Jerry Raves predicted that science would collapse as a result of a lost ethos. I don't have time to indulge in this discussion, but you have the reference there. This is something I got from Silvio this morning. Silvio Funtovic is my source of a fantastic quote. This is an example of the Solar Prize prediction, science collapsing under its own weight. And you have this quote with Twitter, too many journals, too many researchers, too low quality, overflow of information. Okay, next. So just to say that all this is, something which is happening before us at a very quick pace. And then again, I would like to pause just 1 second to say that not necessarily science always is the good solution. This is a famous example from Carl Pearson, who was a social Darwinist, and he was so convinced that you could not improve the genetic fabric of the poor people, so to speak, so that all social programs should be discontinued because they would only increase the number of this feeble stock of non-successful people. Now, a few words about demarcation. Demarcation implies, has been discussed yesterday by Silvio, that you can separate facts from value, but has been said by many. I think has been also hinted in the morning when we were discussing the existence of hybrid arrangements. And the point is that the more people work in hybrid arrangement, the more they appeal to this ideal of separation. Next, for Silvio, whose work I'm quoting here, the demarcation model has a lot of nice features because it can protect science from policy and policy from science, can defend the institution, and can make sure that the scientific information is not driven by agenda. Next slide, please. But and this is a model which, in a sense, many European institutions subscribe to. This is Anne Glover, former Chief Science Advisor. She was a strong subscriber of the demarcation model. But this demarcation model is flawed. I think I don't need to convince you because we had a long discussion about this yesterday. The reason why I'm showing you here Francis Bacon and René Descartes is that to show that this dream, even if you haven't read this particular book of these two philosophers, you have it inside you because the training you have received, the image of science which you probably have in your heart is an image which derives from this intuition. Francis Bacon wrote many centuries ago that science would give us the prolongation of life, the restitution of youth in a certain forms, and he wrote a page of this prediction of what science would achieve. Read the list. We achieved almost all of them. So in fact, you cannot be immune from this dream. It's impossible that you are immune from this dream. Next, and Condorcet, which was really so driven by his work on mathematics for, what we would call today decision theory, he thought that good mathematics would imply good physics, and this would imply good philosophy. At the end of the day, with the use of science, we will solve all our problems, including social problems. And if you want to know more about this, this is a book which we have written with a few colleagues to explore the various dimensions of the Cartesian dream. Next, A few words about economics. You like it or not, economics is a master discipline to frame issues and adjudicate solutions. You heard cost-benefit analysis all over the place. Even yesterday, when Silvio mentioned the precautionary principle, you see embedded into the precautionary principle a request for cost-benefit analysis. I'm a practitioner. I didn't mention it. I'm a natural science by training, and I worked most of my life in modeling, sensitivity analysis, impact assessment. Most sensitivity analyses are really worthless. You know, you just play with them to get the result. It's very easy to play a cost-benefit analysis and get the result you want. You only play, there's no agreement on the discount factor ever. So you just play on the discount factor. You get all, possible values which you want. So I mentioned the twin crisis. You may not know that there have been already 4 important conferences on science integrity, but there was a fantastic conference on what's wrong with economy and with economics, which I just invite you to go and read because all the videos are there. It's a fantastic web to look at. Next, please. In the crisis of economics, I have no time to spend much on it, but historians, as usual, the historians are those who find more problems. In this case, Philo Mirovsky wrote these 2 very interesting books. In my line of business, when I teach sensitivity analysis and sensitivity auditing for modeling, I always use this book for the part on dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling, which have been very much criticized. No time to go into that today. And Eric Reinert has made it clear in a lot of papers and this famous book how the elimination of diversity in economic model, which I've subscribed to, is in a sense leading us toward ruin. I have in this slide a link to a papers which you can find online where it talks about refeudalization. And this book and this paper are very up to date for the European crisis today. So, as I said, there are common elements in the 2 crises. And because there are so much shoddy mathematical and statistical model, you have new lingo. Statisticulation is an old new word, but mathiness is a recent addition. Mathiness, and this is interesting because you remember yesterday Feynman was mentioned in relation to nanotechnology. And now we have Paul Romer, who was an economist, and very bravely pick up a fight with freshwater economists over mathematics used to disguise ideology. And what does it refer to? Who does he refer to? Feynman, his famous lecture on cargo cult, which I cannot tell you the story now, but is fundamentally about intellectual honesty. So you have an economist from within, from the system, who use Feynman as for intellectual to show, I'm also to the end. So to make a story that even economists have to adhere to a minimum of intellectual honesty. It's a very important discussion. So quantification next. So this is probably familiar to most of you, but clear that the appeal of quantification is very strong for bureaucracy. Because by using numbers, bureaucracy can, in a sense, justify their existence. This was, Sylvain discussed this at length yesterday which was very, very clear. So every decision the bureaucracy takes by numbers show that the bureaucracy is impartial. Next, please. You see, quantification is a way of making decisions without seeming to decide. Okay, I think this is what I wanted to say. And that in this sense, the quantification is the discrete charm of bureaucracy. Eric has given an illuminating example yesterday about the use of frames, because fabricating uncertainty is not the only strategy which corporation can use to capture science. By the way, uncertainty can be both amplified and reduced depending on the need. You can, play instrumentally. I mean, this is really the rule of the game. But even more importantly, I think, is the issue of frames and how we perceive the world. This small book, a very small book of George Lakoff, you can read it in half a day, contains illuminating example of how the parties and political institutions. Next, please. And this is an example of how, I'm finished. This is an example of, for instance, on GMO. These are questions which were put to people concerning GMO, and those are the issues which they found to be relevant and important. And you see that food safety is nowhere on this list, okay? The last point, do regulatory authorities have sufficient power and resources to effectively counterbalance large companies, blah, blah, blah? again, the lecture of Sylvain together. How would you answer this question? Next. But if you see, this is how instead the GMO is portrayed in the media. This is presented as a food scare problem, and this is an example which comes from The Economist, where they lambast the labeling scheme introduced in the state of Vermont. I think I have finished. Yeah, this is my case suggestion, which I leave you there for you to read. Thank you.